I am often asked, where exactly was the Jewish East End? Now, I'm pretty sure you know that the Jewish East End didn't have a fixed boundary like the London borough of Tower Hamlets or of Stepney, as it was known in the good old days. Most would accept, though, that on its west side, the Jewish East End would begin about here at Aldgate Pump on the edge of the city. It would then extend for some 2 miles eastwards along the Whitechapel Road, going past Stepney Green Underground Station, to where once upon a time stood the La Boheme Cinema with its popular ballrooms on the corner of Mile End Road and Bidet Road, and then down Bidet Road to the Troxy Cinema in Commercial Road, not far from the docks. Its southern border, in days gone by, that would have been along Cable Street, today transformed into a wide modern roadway to reach Lemon Street near the Tower of London. Its northern border passed through Bethnal Green Road from its Bishopsgate end, where a good many years ago you could visit the Bethnal Green Road Synagogue. Eventually, to reach the open spaces of Victoria Park, oddly enough, in the middle of its very popular boating lake, it had a large Japanese pagoda located on a small island. Before World War II, there were about 80,000 Jews living in this area. Today, doubtful whether you could muster 4,000. Yet whilst not a single kosher butcher or delicatessen store remains in the whole of the East End, it is from here, at Jewish Care's Stepney Jewish Community Centre in Beaumont Grove, hundreds of senior citizens still manage to keep close to their traditional way of life. At the centre, entertainment and stimulation activities are provided. And in keeping with Jewish Care's comprehensive range of services, elderly folk, unable to reach the day centre, rely on a highly efficient kosher Meals on Wheels service, including those in Tower Hamlets high-rise flats.
My favourite soup is Lokshan soup.
It is from here we shall begin to explore why it was that the Jewish East End, its people and places had and still has such an emotive, meaningful story to tell. Some 25 years ago, Phil Hyams, who owned the Troxy Cinema in the Commercial Road, recalled bewildering sights he witnessed of Jewish refugees arriving at Iron Gate Steps at Tower Bridge in 1903.
When the people fled in their thousands and they came to London as well as other cities, and obviously they came to the East End. And I remember quite well that the people in Fieldgate Street put up trestles in the road, brought food, and fed these hungry people. And that's a sight I'll never forget.
20 years ago, Jack Walkine, CBE, retired as Chief Executive Officer of the Borough of Tower Hamlets. He began his career in 1935 as an office boy in the town hall. Just before Jack passed away in 1997, he spoke about his family's close connection with the congregation of Jacob Shul and his work in Tower Hamlets and Stepney. This shul is one of the 5 remaining shuls still holding its regular services.
That shul was not just the place where I got bar mitzvahed. My father was the secretary during the 20s and 30s, and he built that place into a thriving community. And the shul was as much my home as the terraced house where we lived just round the corner in Sydney Street. I'm often asked why I devoted my professional career to a borough in the East End. It might sound pretentious, but those buildings we lived in, those slums throughout East London, I felt I just had to do something to give our people in the borough a decent place to live in.
In the early 1900s, the backyards to the terraced houses in Sydney Street, where Jack Walkine's family lived, looked like this. Here too lived Isaac Berliner, a poor, struggling barber. Falling seriously ill, Berliner, an Orthodox Jew who spoke only Yiddish, was taken to a nearby workhouse infirmary. The frightening atmosphere only aggravated his illness. Making a remarkable recovery, he devoted his life to build a Jewish hospital in the East End. In 1909, with the help of neighbours and supporters, the London Jewish Hospital Association came into being. Through their vigorous campaigning and fundraising, the hospital was eventually built in Stepney Green. Dr. Jerry Black tells the story.
You need to read my book, Lord Rothschild and the Barber, really to appreciate how this Orthodox Yiddish-speaking East Ender, Isaac Berliner, Polish-born, battled against Rothschild. Berliner struggled hard to have a hospital where Yiddish-speaking patients could be suitably cared for. In the nearby Whitechapel, London Hospital had wards which primarily were for Jewish patients, funded generously by Lord Nathaniel Rothschild. He felt that a separate Jewish hospital would be divisive. But for Berliner and his immigrant friends, only a Jewish hospital, staffed by Jewish doctors and Jewish nurses and even Jewish porters, in which Yiddish was really understood, was sufficient. In May 1919, some 13 years after the first meeting in the basement of Berliner's home in Sydney Street, the London Jewish Hospital opened its doors, but only to outpatients. Ironically enough, the first inpatient ward of 21 beds was opened 2 years later by none other than Lord Lionel Rothschild, the son of the nobleman who battled so hard against Berliner. And into the 1920s, the London Jewish, now with 120 beds, attracted excellent staff. It had first-rate facilities, whilst its unique atmosphere certainly aided recovery. Inevitably, after the Second World War, the Jewish exodus from the East End had its effect. The hospital closed in October 1979. The last surgical patient was George Challoner. Like so many cared for at the London Jewish over its 65 years, George belonged to another faith. In 1985, the hospital was demolished to make way for a new private hospital, offering its medical services to the whole community.
A few doors away from the hospital was Stepney Jewish Primary School. Its beginnings go back to the 1870s. But as with the hospital, by the late 1960s, the move to the suburbs had taken its toll. Few Jewish children were joining the school. By 1971, Stepney had now become the new Ilford Primary. Harry Borking came from Stepney to be head teacher. He retired in 1985.
Without question, the move to Ilford was a positive step, and passing on some of our East End traditions certainly made an impact. At school celebrations, old boys and girls would visit Ilford. They had some pretty lively stories to tell about their school days in Stepney. This old boy, Boris Wintergradsky, was the only pupil ever to be expelled from the school. He used to run a halfpenny football sweepstake at playtime. It was this Boris who eventually built up a chain of 300 cinemas, the owner of 8 theatres employing over 12,000 people. As Lord Delfont of Stepney, he was no stranger to Buckingham Palace.
Believe it or not, there is also a close connection between this street, Grey Eagle Street, just off Brick Lane, and Buckingham Palace. Even in the height of his career in the mid-30s, Joe Loss still lived here with his parents. He married Mildred, his teenage sweetheart. Mildred lived just around the corner in Wilk Street. Let Joe tell you all about it.
And as I look now at this particular photograph, with the blessing of having my father and mother beside me, I feel, well, everything that's happened to me, I really owe to them. My father was a very religious man. He was involved with 3 schools, not one. When I was 7, he bought me a violin.
Joe often played to the royal family. In 1979 he was made a Freeman of the City of London. He was also the first British band leader to play in Communist China. I wonder why it was that so many top artists and performers lived in and around Brick Lane. At 12 Hanbury Street, a famous music hall performer, another royal family favourite, was born. Bud Flanagan, the star of the Crazy Gang show. In his biography, Bud tells us his father was frum, religious. One Shabbos, his father waited for him at the stage door. That scene was not a pleasant one. And young Weintraub, for that was his surname, soon left home.
Happy when the daylight comes creeping, caroling the dawn.
Playwright Arnold Wesker lived in Fashion Street. In his illustrated book on the East End he writes, "It's a trap, the East End, to be sentimental and full of cosy longing for the good old days. But my family, they remember it with misery. I may be riddled with nostalgia, but not them. Nothing good about the good old days for them." Wolf Mankiewicz, author and playwright, spent his formative years around Brick Lane. In this East End novel, he pays tribute to Brick Lane's famous Russian vapor bars. At Shevchik's, you can rely on the heat day or night. Rheumatism is melted, veins become less varicose, the lumbago and all the creaks in the back are eased. You feel like an angel walking through the green fields of Brick Lane. And it was from growing up in those side streets of Brick Lane that brought Lionel Bart world fame for his brilliant musical Oliver. Whilst talented personalities like Joe Loss, Bud Flanagan, Arnold Wesker, Wolf Mankiewicz and Lionel Bart can be rightly proud of their East End origins, in this side street off Brick Lane, next door to the one-time Princelet Street Synagogue, Tower Hamlets paid tribute to one of the borough's celebrated citizens, Miriam Moses, OBE JP. Miriam was born here at number 17 in 1886. In 1921, following on her father's footsteps, she became a borough councillor and a JP. In 1925, she became the leader of the Brady Girls Club. Miriam was elected Mayor of Stepney in 1931, becoming the first British Jewish woman to be a mayor. No wonder then, in 1958, in the year she retired after 33 years managing Brady, Miriam was the star in Eamon Andrews' TV show, This Is Your Life.
I became personal secretary to Miriam Moses in 1936, and I was very proud to be able to work for her at the Brady Club in Hanbury Street. To many, I'm sure, she appeared to be a relic from the old Victorian way of doing things. She was chairman of so many educational establishments, health committees, youth organisations and voluntary bodies. And by the way, Miriam would never desecrate the Sabbath. Even when she was a mayor, if she had a civic duty to perform, she would not ride on Shabbos. In spite of all the pressures on her, I cannot remember her in any way as a hard, domineering person. Indomitable she certainly was. I admired her greatly.
Whilst Miriam held fast to traditional Judaism and its family life, she still enjoyed a warm, close relationship with Sir Basil Henricus, the equally no-nonsense leader of the Oxford and St George's Club and the East End's Reformed Synagogue. Together, they served for over 30 years as JPs, mainly at the Toynbee Hall Juvenile Court in Commercial Street. Izzy Gold, some 70 years ago, was a very active lad at the Oxford and St George's Club in Berners Street off the Commercial Road. In 1973, Izzy received the MBE for his community work. He served as a JP for over 14 years. He died in July 2005. His life's work of helping others went well beyond the boundaries of the East End.
I was born in Cable Street, and I had the special privilege of going to Christian Street School. Now, that's my junior school, Christian Street School. Christian Street, what a name. We all thought it a bit of a joke. There was 35 of us in the class, of which only 4 were non-Jewish children. And right opposite us was where I got bar mitzvahed, the Commercial Road Tamatara. Now what was the tough part of my bar mitzvah? Not the pasha. I found that comparatively easy. It was going into the ladies' gallery, having to kiss my whole family, and especially my bubba and all her close friends. My best bar mitzvah present? That was the year I was allowed to join the Oxford and St George's Club. To be able to get away to camp. There's Henricus, the gaffer in the doorway. Boy, was that excitement. To leave those slummy East End streets and join in the fun with him. He brought a whole new dimension into our lives. Let me remind you, it was tough to find a job in the 30s, but the gaffer got many club boys their jobs, including myself. The club gave us a powerful sense of belonging. You really felt you belonged to something special, and we still belong to each other. That's our club's famous cry. We were yelling that cry 90 years ago.
In 1914, the one-time Rains Boys' School in Cannon Street Road, off the Commercial Road, was where Henricus opened the Oxford and St George's Club. By the late 1920s, strangely enough, the club's success brought into being the Habonim youth movement. For nearly opposite the clubhouse was Reb Avram's Lipschitz Hebrew classes. His classes met every day. Lipschitz was a fervent Zionist, even collecting halfpennies from his pupils for the pioneering work in Palestine.
There were over 100 boys in my father's cheder, and until this day I can't fathom out how we, as a family of 9, even had a home there at all. I knew my father was very concerned about Henricus' anti-Zionist attitude. Henricus wanted his club members to be first and foremost Englishmen. They should have no interest in the Chalutzim in Palestine, and God forbid they should become pioneers. Now, my brother Chaim was a Rover Scout, together with Wellesley Aaron, a Zionist educationist. They developed a program linking scouting activities with Zionist objectives. With strong support from my father, Habonim's first group, Gedut Trumpeldor, was formed in 1929. Its regular meeting place in its early days was in our home. So thanks to Basil Henricus, that is how Habonim, now the largest Jewish youth movement in the world, began its life in Stepney, in Cannon Street Road.
Today, Fabian Trimmings, here in Cannon Street Road, is just a few shops away from where the original Oxford and St George's Clubhouse used to be. Until 1972, the Fabian building was a prominent Federation synagogue in the East End. In the 1930s, Cantor Halter was the shul's exceptional chassan. He composed many synagogal pieces. His boys' choir was considered by many to be far superior than the great synagogue choir in Duke's Place. Here in New Road, Dhaka Kebab, just 5 minutes walk from where Chassan Halter's shul used to be, here was the New Road Synagogue, another prominent Federation shul. But before it was Dhaka Kebab, the premises housed an Asian dress factory. The owner assured us, in the Jewish cupboard, as he put it, he kept only his finest silks. The dress manufacturer willingly allowed us to remove the 10 Commandments. We've crossed over the Whitechapel Road into Valence Road. We're heading for Hughes Mansions. Here, one of the last V-2 rocket attacks of the war in 1945 severely damaged the building. This was just a few months before hostilities ended. It happened on Erev Pesach, 130 people were killed. 120 were Jewish. Complete families were wiped out, one where only the grandfather survived to bury 2 sons, 2 daughters, a daughter-in-law, and a grandson. One of the sons had just returned after 4 years on the battlefronts. The war's air raids on the East End, though, did result in some significant changes. Whilst Hughes Mansions was completely rebuilt to its pre-war days, Old Montague Street, on the other side of the road, once a narrow roadway where seldom a car was seen, is today a busy thoroughfare all the way from Valence Road to Brick Lane. Even after the war, Old Montague Street and its side streets were considered to be the very heart of the Jewish East End, and for good reason too. For more or less in the middle of Old Montague Street were the steps leading you down to Black Line Yard, the treasured alleyway of jewellery shops. Of the 23 shops, 11 were jewellers: Segelov, Leighton, Feldman, Brilliant Stone, Schlossberg, Silver, Elgrod, Fishberg, Granite, Schumann, and Reginski. Walking back to Old Montague Street, on the left, just before the steps, was Evans the cowkeeper's. The Yiddish lettering declares this milk was frisch von der Kuh, fresh from the cow. Unbelievable as it may seem, behind those black gates, Evans kept 32 cows. 32 cows! But possibly even more remarkable, opposite Evans the Milk at 18 Black Line Yard, it was here, in the mid-1930s, that Joseph Shaposhnik, a rabbi linked for some time to the Federation of Synagogues, had set up his own office as the chief rabbi of the London Jewish Orthodox Beth Din, in defiant opposition to the United Synagogue and Chief Rabbi Hertz. Pinny Dunner is researching the life story of East London's most controversial rabbi.
Rabbi Joseph Shaposhnik is surely London's most colourful and unique religious personality. In the history of religious Jews in London, there's no one who had more conflict with the chief rabbi and his Beis Din as Rabbi Shaposhnik did. Not only that, he set up his own kashrus authority, his own board of shechita, in direct competition with the official bodies meant to administer kashrus in London and beyond. You should know that his kashrus stamp didn't just extend to the East End, but went beyond, far beyond Twickenham. There is a biscuit company called the Golden Biscuit Company, in which he supervised biscuits for use on Passover, and the stamp still remains to this day. In Black Lion Yard, Rabbi Shaposhnik, although he's listed there as running a Beis Din, what he was really doing was running a surgery for herbal remedies, for which he was very famous and much sought after, and people from across London, Jews and non-Jews, would come to him to see him about their various ailments, ranging from rheumatism to asthma to skin diseases and anything that they felt that he could help. In 1928, King George V was very ill. He was a very popular king, and Rabbi Shaposhnik seized on the moment and sent Buckingham Palace his suggestion for remedies that he said would cure King George V. And as a result, he received a letter back from the royal physician. This, of course, was trumpeted by Rabbi Shaposhnik as a massive success, and the whole East End regaled in this particular event. Sadly, Rabbi Shaposhnik died at the young age of 55 in 1937 from a terrible illness called stricture, which affected his kidneys, and he died on the operating table at the London Jewish Hospital. He was so controversial and so unpopular amongst the establishment that they refused to have anything to do with his burial. The United Synagogue refused to bury him. The Federation of Synagogues refused to bury him, until finally Rabbi Solomon Schonfeld, the presiding rabbi of the Adass, together with his president Bernard Homer, agreed on certain conditions with his son Levi to bury Rabbi Shaposhnik in the fledgling Adass Cemetery in Enfield, where hopefully he rests in peace to this day.
We're back in Old Montague Street. For old time's sake, let's return to the 1970s. A few yards away from Black Lion Yard, you would have reached the Chevresha Synagogue, the last of many shuls and shtibluch around Old Montague Street, but no more. Where the Chevresha once stood, a Salvation Army Centre caring for women was built. In the Amolika Yuron, this boarded-up frontage was one of Strongwater's butcher shops. Across the road was the one and only Jack Marks, possibly the most well-known fruiterer in the East End. Why the queue? This was March 1945. The war against the Nazis was still raging. Bananas and oranges were seldom seen. But Fat Jack, as he was known to his many customers, somehow or other got hold of a consignment of those rare bananas. No wonder there was a policeman there to control the crowds. Jack was not just an East End fruiterer. Bob Hope had good reason to congratulate him for his many years raising funds for a number of charities. The shop with the sunblind down was close to Fat Jack. Here you bought your succulent herrings from Mrs. Marks. Facing Mrs. Marks was Kalingold, the Hebrew book publisher. Only a few doors away in Old Montague Street were 3 other Jewish bookshops. Amazing when you realize that around the corner in Osborne Street was Golub, Shapiro Valentine close by in Wentworth Street, and Mazin in Whitechapel Road, only a few minutes from Old Montague Street. And it was here that the bagel queens Esther and Annie held court. Esther would give you in Tatnaran, a choice fruity curse in Yiddish, should you buy from Annie and not her. Their outbursts would often drown the Zionist and Communist speakers who regularly had their rallies outside Bloom's restaurant on a Sunday morning. Where you see Career and Sons, this was the corner of Old Montague Street and Brick Lane where Bloom's first established its reputation before moving to Whitechapel High Street and then on to Golders Green Road. No surprise then that back in 1937, world heavyweight boxing champion Max Baer, sitting beside Morris Bloom, had his salt beef and latkes in Brick Lane. Whilst in days gone by the street names surrounding Brick Lane appeared only in English, today Bengali lettering is added to help the new dominant Bangladeshi community. A few Jewish traders are still in Brick Lane, but you will find it very difficult to see a Jewish name on a shop front. The Bangla City poster is opposite the corner of Brick Lane and Fournier Street, for here stands a unique house of prayer. It was in 1975 that this building became the first major mosque in East London. 232 years earlier, Huguenots, fleeing Catholic persecution in France, built this large house of prayer. 66 years later, in 1809, it was bought by the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity to the Jews. With little success after 10 years or so, the building was bought by the Methodists. It became their main chapel in the East End. But in the late 1800s, with ever-increasing Jewish immigration, aggravated by deteriorating housing, the Methodists sold out to the growing Mahziki Hadass community in Brick Lane. At its inauguration service, the 11th of September 1898, its English name was presented as the Spitalfields Great Synagogue. But to the community at large it was always the Mahziki Hadass, the shul that always offered a minyan, be it day or night. In its cheder, children studied Hebrew texts with translations in Yiddish. The language surrounding them, of course, was English, and out of that medley came some outstanding pupils. Selig Badetsky was one of them. In 1920, he became Professor of Mathematics at the Leeds University, President of the Board of Deputies in 1939, and 10 years later, Chancellor of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It was at the Jews Free School in Bell Lane, 10 minutes' walk from the Mahziki Hadass, Badetsky received his primary education. In the early 1900s, the JFS, with over 3,000 pupils, was the largest school in the world, not just in London. There were more than 70 classrooms with over 100 teachers. The school was so big that most classrooms had, at that time, the newly invented telephone for contact with the head teacher. All were fitted with electric light. Some 40 years later, in 1941, during the nightly air raid blitz on East London, the JFS was bombed beyond repair. Only a few streets away, the great synagogue in Duke's Place had also been completely destroyed. Today, all that remains in Duke's Place, where Anglo Jewry's foremost synagogue once stood, is this small commemorative plaque lost against the grey walls of a city office block. Not so the JFS. In 1958, the school was rebuilt in Camden Town, North London. Some 50 years later, the JFS, stronger than ever, has found a new home in Kenton, Middlesex. The school, though, makes sure that today's pupils know about its roots in the East End, where in those good old days at the JFS gates in Bell Lane and Frying Pan Alley, there was no greenery to welcome the youngsters to school. Instead, then it was surrounded by Petticoat Lane and its neighbouring market streets. But for us East End kids, the lane and its side turnings were a wonderland of excitement. But for others, it was a workplace. About 60 years ago, 14-year-old Philip Solomon, standing there flecking his henna, began his career at the family chicken stall in the lane.
Working in the family business all my life with my family, and I might add my father, Aumie Shapiro's father, grandfather and great-grandfather before him. There was, rather, I should say, 27 kosher poultry stalls in Golson Street where I was working. In the lane, everybody knew Jackie Braffman because he was, as I say, a character.
No, lady there! One lucky lady. £8, it was quickly. You've heard the Christian Dior? I'm the Yiddish Dior. He's a Christian one.
What a charitable man he was as well. He raised thousands of pounds for charity, and he just was a mensch. We must mention a character that was known throughout Europe for his delicatessen, Mossy Marks, the one and only Mossy. You know, Mossy Marks' delicatessen was so well known. Outside as well was his barrels, the big barrels with the herrings and the cucumbers, and you'd put your hand in, slap out what you want. It was so well known. Even Maggie Thatcher come there, though I never saw Maggie put her hand in the barrel and slap out a herring or a cucumber. What a character Mossy was. But the final person I must mention was the man that everybody knew, also the world over, Prince Monolulu. I got a horse! You know, he used to stand by my stall on a Sunday morning. He said to me one day, I got a horse. I said, Prince, I've got nowhere to put it.
I've got a horse! I've got an ass to beat the favourite! Who give you money for nothing, the bookmaker, if you are lucky?
Monolulu certainly knew Petticoat Lane and Wentworth Street well, but I doubt very much if he ever set foot here in Hessel Street Market, just off the Commercial Road. 50 years ago, there were 70 shops here, every one Jewish. Not one remains. There were 10 grocers, 5 fruiterers, 4 bakers, 9 butchers, 8 poulterers. There were shops selling shoes, sweets, hardware, feathers, even a tinsmith. But there was only one tailor. You know which trade had the most shops? Fishmongers. There were 19 fishmongers. And the most famous of all was international boxing promoter Jack Solomon's. Between fights, he'd pop back to help out the family fish shop in Hessel Street. But let's cross over now from Hessel Street to fashions in the Commercial Road. Before 1970, it was here that London's premier Yiddish theatre, the Grand Palais, under the direction of Mayor Zelniker, had been attracting enthusiastic audiences. So often, the leading lady was his daughter, Anna.
My father, Mayor Zelniker, was the director, the actor, the producer in the Grand Palais Theatre in Commercial Road, London E1. And the Grand Palais stayed the Yiddish theatre until right to the end. It was the last Yiddish theatre in London because we gave them what they wanted, and that was a zing, a lach und a twer. In English it is a song, a laugh with a tear. And now we come to a most important part of my life. What happened next made history in the Yiddish theatre, not only in England but all over the world. And it happened at the Grand Palais on the 31st of December 1943 and ran for 8 months into 1944. And that was The King of Lampedusa. And it became an overnight success. An overnight success. And the play ran for 8 months, and we were inundated with calls for tickets, and not all Jews, non-Jews alike came to see it. But I must tell you about this. An incident happened. One morning the telephone rang, and our manageress, Mrs. Isakovich, answered the phone, and a very cultured English voice said, "We would like you to reserve 6 seats for Winston Churchill and company, who wish to come and see the play The King of Lampedusa this evening." It was a hoax played on us by the opposition theatre in the Adler Street. They thought they were so jealous of the wonderful success we had with The King of Lampedusa that they played this trick on us. Little did they know how far it would go.
Here in the Whitechapel Road, over 90 years ago, Morris Myers first published his daily Yiddish newspaper, Die Zeit. That was in 1913. In those days, there were close to 75,000 Jews in the East End, but by 1950 the paper closed down. By then, so many Yiddish-speaking immigrants no longer needed a Yiddish newspaper. I know my own father was helped with his English by the ever-increasing use of English in Die Zeit's advertisements. The Yiddish writer Avram Stenzel, who lived in Whitechapel, would have none of it. In the 1940s, he launched his own Yiddish journal, Loschen and Leben. He struggled hard to keep Yiddish pure. He established the Friends of Yiddish, and to this day, the Friends still come from all over London to meet regularly at Toynbee Hall, close to the Whitechapel Road. If for some of us, Old Montague Street was the heart of the once-upon-a-time Jewish East End, then, without question, Whitechapel Road was its backbone. For youngsters, a special pastime was strolling along the Whitechapel Waste, for here it was, on one of the widest pavements in London, boy met girl. No wonder it was known as the Monkey Parade. But how many people ever noticed or can remember the significance of this drinking fountain facing the London Hospital? The plaque reads, "In grateful and loyal memory of Edward VII, erected from subscriptions from Jewish inhabitants of East London." The date? 1911. But here, beside the hospital, was a highly cherished institution frequented by so many, Johnny Isaac's, the acclaimed fish and chip shop. In the 1930s, Johnny Isaac's was opposite Wickham's, the departmental store in the Mile End Road, known as the Harrods of the East End. But talking of cherished institutions, then surely it was behind this advertising hoarding so much of East End life flourished. For here stood the Pavilion Theatre. Long before the Grand Palais opened, Yiddish plays were continuously presented here. World-famous cantors gave concerts to packed audiences, and the Pavilion became a synagogue for the high holidays. Local Jewish boxers like British welterweight champion Kid Berg and British lightweight champion Harry Misler equally brought thousands to the Pavilion. In 1937, though, the Pavilion closed down. It was to become a cinema, a variety theatre, but to this very day, only colourful advertisements have been presented at this memorable site. Some 20 years ago, here was the last Christian mission struggling to convert East End Jews. Even as late as the 1980s, 3 other missions were at work in the area. Their conversion activities met with very little success. 2 doors along was Davenant. It was founded in 1680 as a boys' school by St. Mary's Whitechapel Church. From the 1920s until the Second World War in 1939, 98% of the lads in this church school were Jewish. Today, no Jewish boy will be seen entering the Davenant Foundation buildings. The complex has for several years now met the educational needs of the local Muslim Bangladeshi community. Just across the road, East London's largest mosque and community centre dominates the Whitechapel Road. At no time did the Jewish community have a building along the highways of Stepney and Whitechapel which could possibly compare with the grandeur of the mosque. But where this mosque stands today, here was the Rivoli Cinema. In the 1930s, for just a few coppers you would have a 3-hour program made up of 2 feature films, news and cartoons, plus a variety show. I wonder if the Muslim leaders are aware that the Rivoli was regularly used as a synagogue for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services. At Hanukkah time, the local Hebrew classes would have their prize day celebrations, singing Moed Sur HaTikva before the Laurel Hardy film show. Yet today, it is good to record that in Filgate Street, right around the corner, behind the mosque, one of the 5 remaining East End synagogues enjoys a mutual friendly relationship with their Muslim neighbours. Let's now return from Filgate Street to this corner where Great Torick Street, previously known as Great Garden Street, meets the Whitechapel Road. Here until the late 1970s were the offices of North Thames Gas. For Jewish EastEnders, this was the traditional spot for tailors to keep in touch with the ups and downs of the trade, who's gone bankrupt, or possibly to find a new governor willing to pay a decent hourly rate. They came together on Sunday mornings. On Sunday afternoons, though, just across the Whitechapel Road, a more joyous activity was taking place. Here was the #1 studio for the bridal wedding portrait. Boris claimed it was quite normal for him to photograph at least 15 couples on a Sunday.
To me, a bridal couple, when they came in, was like a prince and princess, because my love for my work could only see beauty in every one that came into my studio. Even when they were a little bit nervous, with a few very kind words, looking in their face, they warmed up towards me very quickly, and I got what I wanted, and that was that they should look their very best.
Standing here some 60 years ago, looking towards the city, the skyline would have looked like this. The trees are in the grounds of St. Mary's Whitechapel Church. By the way, those trees are also on the corner of Adler Street, the only street in Great Britain to be named after a chief rabbi. And in the distance, you can just about see the Clock Tower Gardeners, the clothing store on the junction of the 4 major roads in East London. But before we reach that historic Gardens Corner, we pass 2 institutions which played such a significant role in the educational and cultural lives of East End folk, the Whitechapel Art Gallery and the library. Next time you're near Aldgate East Station, by the library, look out for the plaque dedicated to the East Ender Isaac Rosenberg, the acclaimed poet and painter of the First World War. You'll also be close to Albert's the Gents Outfitter. Above the door, the elaborate Magen David was designed by the Polish artist Arthur Szyk. In 1935, here were the editorial and printing offices of the only London Jewish daily newspaper to appear in English. After only a few months it went bankrupt, but the Magen David remains to this day. Nothing, though, remains of the gardener's clothing store. Its clock tower overlooked the crossroads where Whitechapel High Street, Commercial Road, Aldgate High Street, Mansell Street and Commercial Street met. Although it survived many Nazi air raids on the East End, 27 years after the war in 1972, Gardeners was burnt to the ground. Today, a major bank has its offices where Gardeners used to be. Bus conductors no longer call out Gardener's Corner, but gardeners will always have a special pride of place in the history of London's East End. On Sunday, 4th of October 1936, Black Shirt leader Mosley, with hundreds of his anti-Semitic supporters, was stopped by some 65,000 demonstrators from marching through the Jewish East End.
I'll never forget that Sunday. I was only 15 at the time. I lived in Stepney Green. I went to Redmond's Road Talmud Torah, and I was a member of Habonim. So we all knew what a menace Mosley was. With some school friends from Rains, we followed the crowds to Gardener's Corner. Thousands of us were there. We blocked the road. We had to stop Mosley. Police were shouting, "Let them through," and we all shouted back, "They shall not pass, they shall not pass." And then I just could not believe it. The mounted police with their truncheons charged right into us. Thank God we were at the back of the crowd. But we stopped them, even when they tried to get through the side streets, like Cable Streets. There were barricades there. But I must tell you, without the support of our non-Jewish neighbours, especially the Dockers, no way could we have stopped Moses' march into our East End.
In the weeks that followed, Mosley's bully boys went into action. Jewish shops along the Mile End Road and at other locations had their windows smashed, and the troubles continued until the war against Hitler began in 1939. The Jewish East End was close to the London docks near Tower Bridge. With German air raids expected, the evacuation of school children began.
My most emotional experience as a youngster living in Spitalfields was evacuation day itself. I'll never forget that Saturday morning. We were led through the back streets to Liverpool Street Station, and as we passed the small synagogues, carrying our haversacks and gas masks, men stood by the doors in their prayer shawls, their talesim, weeping as we went by. Nobody knew where we were going, and they probably thought that they would never see us again. Thousands of homes and businesses were bombed out of existence. So when the war ended in 1945, many families had little reason to return to the East End. Even by the early 1920s, the East End's Jewish population was already in decline. By the 1970s, many synagogues no longer existed. Even the famous Machzek Das, the shul that never closed, had moved from Brick Lane to Golders Green. And major communal organisations like the Board of Guardians left Middlesex Street also for Golders Green. For many, the Jewish East End has become just a nostalgic memory. For others, perhaps it was good riddance to a dismal existence.
A dismal existence it certainly was for those who lived in those dingy tenement buildings, often sharing a bed with others in the family. Without question, for many life was hard, very hard. The moneylender was certainly no stranger. Even into the 1970s, the soup kitchen in Broome Street near Petticoat Lane was still helping the needy. But putting some of the poverty Bubbermeises aside, the Jewish East End wasn't just an overcrowded, slummy, deprived area for the underprivileged. Arbor Square, just off Commercial Road, was one of 4 well-kept public gardens within 10 minutes walking distance of each other. Monty Richardson, a veteran youth and community worker, is still active in the area. He was a member of Chaim Lipschitz's first Habonim group and soon after the war became manager of the Brady Club.
I grew up just off Arbor Square. Yes, it was the Blitz that made our family move to Edgware. Today my home is in Hampstead, but the East End is still an integral part of my life. Like Nat Conboy, I went to Redmond's Road Talmud Torah and Rains Foundation School. In days gone by, this was Rains. Its educational standards were very high and discipline was excellent. And I can assure you, I was not the only East Ender at Cambridge where I took my degree. The East End had excellent libraries, evening classes, and of course so many clubs for boys and girls. And for our Yiddish-speaking parents and grandparents, they had the Jewish Institute in Adler Street and Toynbee Hall in Commercial Street to help them improve their zerbrochene English.
Close to Arbor Square is Ford Square. In this terraced house, Samuel Fisher was born in 1905. 68 years later, in 1973, he was elected President of the Board of Deputies. He had played a major role in unifying the work of the East End's Jewish-friendly societies and established a unique record of being elected Mayor of Stoke Newington and later to become the first Mayor of the Borough of Camden. In 1974, with Lord Greenwood and Lord Wells Purcell on as his sponsors, he was made a life Baron, Lord Fisher of Camden. Years ago, Sammy spoke of his childhood.
My own parents came from Bialystok, and although I was born in the East End of London, I spoke Yiddish and only realized that there was a language called English when I went to school.
Sammy went to Ashford Street Primary School. It was known then as Rutland Street. His bar mitzvah was at the nearby Philpott Street Synagogue. He completed his secondary education at Myrtle Street Central, just off the Commercial Road. In 1986, Chief Rabbi Lord Jacobowitz said it all when he paid this tribute to Sammy.
Sammy Fisher had the precious gift of bringing a measure of joy into the lives of us all. Jews and non-Jews, Hasidim and non-traditionalists, high dignitaries and simple folk.
Henry Grunwald, QC, was elected President of the Board of Deputies in 2004.
I also went to Rutland Street Primary, and my bar mitzvah and offer for my wedding took place in East End Shawls. My home today is in northwest London, but my East End upbringing, as with Sammy Fisher, has given me a meaningful sense of community and of sharing our self-help traditions and expertise with others. I wonder how many people realise that opposite the one-time People's Palace in the Mile End here, over 200 years ago, was the first Jewish hospital in Great Britain. It opened in 1795. The hospital cared for the elderly and for training youngsters for work. It soon became the Jewish orphanage at Norwood. 75 years later, in 1870, Dr. Bernardo opened his very first orphanage in Stepney Causeway, not far from Arbor Square. That was just about the same time as the Dutch Jewish community, the Chutz as they were known, opened their own synagogue in Sandys Row, near Petticoat Lane. On April the 5th, 2005, Chief Rabbi Sir Jonathan Sachs with other communal leaders were at Sandys Row. The community was celebrating its 150th anniversary. I've been told that before the Second World War, there were over 50 synagogues in the East End. Today, only 5 are struggling to survive. Our once-upon-a-time community is no more, but we must not forget, nor let the generations to come ignore the history and the wide-ranging contribution EastEnders have made in so many ways throughout the world.